So again, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, as your time zone may have it. Welcome back to our conference exploring some really interesting issues at the intersection of theology and philosophy focused on religious naturalism. We have four wonderful speakers, terrific speakers this afternoon. And so I think without further ado, I'm going to call on my Kaplan Center colleague, Mel Sculp, to kick things off with his presentation titled Kaplan Seeks His God.
Okay. First of all, I want to say how grateful I am for this morning's session. I found the papers very valuable and very moving. And it was a genuine religious experience, particularly in the case of Arthur Green, who I think all of us felt that very moving kind of feeling. I think also there was a recognition. Are you hearing me? Yeah. I think also there was a recognition about my conviction that beneath Kaplan's concern with Jewish peoplehood and pragmatism, there lies a lifelong religious search, a spiritual search. Kaplan, for me, was the ultimate seeker. And that search is detailed in his diary, where we find the most exciting moments of his thinking, not in his sermons and not in his books, but in the diary, where he could give his thinking free rein and allow his ongoing creative dialogue with the tradition to move forward. Kaplan's reliance on the diary is fully understandable. He stated the reasons himself. It has to do with the material he thought too complicated for the congregation, the SAJ. I think maybe he underestimated them, or material that he taught too radical for his rabbinical students at the Jewish Theological Seminary. So he recorded, where else to record it but in the diary? This is, of course, a very thinly veiled advertisement for my next volume of the diary selections, which covers the years 1942 to 51, and will be out in early October. There is a discount. If you put in F as in Frank and W as in wonderful, 20, FW20, you will get 30% off when you order the book. So we must begin with a very important distinction between the belief in God and the concept of God. Kaplan believed in God very deeply. He thought about God all the time, but he changed his concept of God more often than he changed his clothes. Kaplan's theology is, at the beginning, a predicate theology. Predicate theology is fundamental to his system. He thinks in terms of qualities, not things. He coined the wonderful word to thingify. We tend to turn processes into things and qualities into persons. Hypostasize is a term he liked, which we seldom use today, and which is similar. He wants us to habituate to speak of the divine, not of God. He thus differentiates between object theology, which embraces things themselves, and predicate theology, which points towards qualities and attributes. Nevertheless, hypostasize, we must remember, is really a double-edged sword. The mind and the soul are an endless source of idols, I think Calvin once said. But at the same time, we must say that the concept of God is an hypostasizing of perfection. That formulation, by the way, is really not mine. It comes from Santayana. Kaplan has been called the genius of eminence, but let us emphasize that he did not consider himself an atheist. It would be a very significant mistake to think that Kaplan was an atheist and did not have the courage to admit it. For him, identifying God completely with the world is the core of atheism. In his words, and this is very early, 1913, the moment, quote, the moment God is merely identified with the world and conceived as being immanent but not transcendent, his divinity is denied and he is dissolved into the world. This is atheism and pantheism, which religion so vigorously contends against. This is from the Kaplan Diary, 1913. We use the term predicate theology, but I would maintain that it is a very weak term. It would tell us that the core theological concepts are a matter of grammar. This is obviously not the case, but the formulation encourages us to think so. Additionally, calling the attributes or predicates divine is also a weak formulation because of the way in which the word divine is used in our culture. We say of a woman's clothes, they are divine, or of a hat, that it looks divine. Rather than speak of predicates, we must speak of ideals. The concept of ideals gives us a much stronger formulation. It has gravitas. Ideals have power and perhaps even reality, as the Platonist and the idealist would tell us. For Kaplan, the ideals have an independent ontological status. They are independent of our devotions. To put it another way, Kaplan maintains that we cannot reduce theology to moral categories. In a well-known passage in The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, he states, quote, for God must not be merely held as an idea. He must be felt as a presence if we want not only to know God, to know about God, but to know God. This idea of God as presence is a very, very fundamental aspect of Kaplan's theology, which I will repeat and indicate over and over. The most outstanding example of Kaplan and the independence of ideals comes from the initial encounter with Heschel. Remember that Kaplan's discovery of Heschel came in the wake of Heschel's first article, published in English, An Analysis of Piety, which appeared in 1942. Kaplan was most interested in Heschel's account of the status of spiritual values and particularly of piety. Spiritual values were not merely psychological or rational, but they were something very, very personal. Kaplan, in discussing this matter of the article from the Review of Religion where it appeared, quotes from Heschel. And he says the following. This is Heschel in the Kaplan Diary. Ideas are not to be confused with the psychical setting in which they appear. It is fallacious to identify knowledge with the process of its acquisition or realization. The spiritual content is not identical with the act itself, nor are concepts tantamount to the functions of the mind. The spiritual objective content is universal. Piety is an objective spiritual quality. That's what grabs Kaplan most fundamentally. This is only one example, and there are many others, as we shall demonstrate. Kaplan is not the pure naturalist. He has his theistic moments, and they are not all that rare. A most interesting assertion is to be found in the introduction to the 1945 prayer book, for which Kaplan was excommunicated, as you remember. There we find an outline of the changes in the prayer book, which Kaplan introduced, along with the injunction, quote, if prayer is to be genuine and not merely the recital of words, the worshiper must, of course, believe in God. He must be able to sense the reality of God vividly as an intense, personal experience. End of quote. A bit later in the introduction, we find one of Kaplan's most theistic statements. Quote, what we think of as a coherent universe or cosmos is more than nature. It is nature with a soul. That soul is God. My scholarly colleagues and I have argued about these words at length and whether Kaplan actually wrote them. They may, as a matter of fact, have come from Milton Steinberg, but in any case, it is certain that nothing appeared in the prayer book without Kaplan's approval. Allow me for a moment a bit of psychologizing about Kaplan's theology. Kaplan loved his father very much, and he lived at home until he was 27. I would propose that the traditional never left his mind. One sees it in the meaning of God, where he struggles with the fundamental theological issues and gives us God as presence, which I mentioned above. This is very, very far from the naturalist Kaplan we think we know from Judaism as a civilization. Kaplan, of course, did not consider the realm of ideals supernatural. He used the term transnatural to describe this aspect of theology. This term, however, is unfortunate and means very little intuitively. But there is another possibility which I discovered some years ago and which I found very, very valuable. That is supranaturalism. Not supernaturalism, but supranaturalism. Supernaturalism has its miracles, its magic, and God as a self that are implied in that concept. But supranaturalism is a concept of naturalism where one might say we are pushed beyond ourselves. Allow me to give you the text from which I draw this concept. It comes from the diary, as so many of my other discoveries do. Dan, can I have text number 1? This is
yes. Just give me 1 second.
This is the diary in 1940, in July, and Kaplan was, of course, at the shore in Long Branch, New Jersey. I come from New Jersey. Arthur comes from New Jersey, and so I feel it's a wonderful source of foundational theological thinking. So here's what he says in July 1940. In the yearning for salvation, for life's worthwhileness, for truth, goodness, and beauty for their own sake, for freedom, justice, and peace in society, man experiences something superhuman or supranatural. One who experiences that yearning in himself cannot be so vain or reasonable as to believe that he is alone in the possession of such yearning. In other words, it's the yearning itself, the yearning for the ideal, Kaplan tells us, which we find something beyond the natural. But let us emphasize that we are not talking about the realm of the supernatural. One might say that in Kaplan's mind, our theological impulses point beyond themselves. The yearning for the ideal points to the reality of the ideals. The fundamental issue here is a familiar one and concerns the ontological status of the ideals. Kaplan, in his concept of the supranatural, moves beyond the empirically verifiable and beyond the actual. I don't know whether Arthur is still listening, but I hope he might like the idea of the supranatural to characterize his own theology. At times, Kaplan goes further than his statement on yearning. The most amazing passage in this regard comes from the diary in 1939 and clearly indicates the other side of Kaplan's mind, which transcends the sociological and the Durkheimian. In 1939, he puts forth 2 fundamental axioms of his thought, which are relevant to our point. First, he states, quote, that the very ground of all reality is mind. Mind is the least capable of being named or described. Whatever we can know about it is not noumenal, but phenomenal. Yet we experience its reality with an immediacy which cannot belong to any of its objects. Here is Kaplan, the sociologist, become theologian, sounding like some German idealist of the 19th century, asserting that mind is the ground of all reality. And of course, our ideals are of our mind. Yes. In considering Kaplan's formulation of God as the power that makes for salvation, the self is central. It is from the self's urge to growth, to life abundant, to the ideals, as Kaplan states it, that we are on our way to the transcendent. The self points the way to God. Once we have lost the traditional revelation, the only possibility of experiencing Godhood, according to Kaplan, is the discovery of some phase of one's inner life that points to God. In other words, quote, the experience of selfhood, this is from Kaplan, the experience of selfhood should constitute the gateway through which we ought to be able to enter into the presence of God. At the beginning of Kaplan's Hebrew work, which is a translation, which is entitled Ha'emunah V'Musar, that the Kaplan Center is working on translating, Kaplan quotes Joseph Albo. This is on the first page, and the quotation is, Da et nafshecha v'teda et borecha. Know yourself, and you will know your creator, Albo says. Sounds directly from Aristotle and Plato. Though we begin with the self, we do not, of course, remain within the boundaries of the self. Most significantly, Kaplan introduces us to the notion of cosmic support, which I'm very interested to hear Ari mention that this morning, which is the basic aspect of his theology. I would go so far as to maintain that Kaplan is one with Heschel in seeing God in search of man, but he does it. That Kaplan is not identified with Heschel, but he does isolate the impulse which leads people to need a God who is concerned with humanity. That impulse is the hunger for cosmic support. In naturalistic terms, one might say that the universe favors the emergence of the higher forms of life, of which we are certainly one. The notion of cosmic support is at the core of a demythologized essence of God in Kaplan. Heschel says God cares. Kaplan says the universe, the cosmos, supports our consciousness and our conscience and our higher functioning. In the matter of ideals, I would like to use George Santayana as a midrash on Kaplan. Kaplan read and valued Santayana. Those of you who know my work know that I have used Emerson, Felix Adler, and a number of Christian theologians in the same way. These thinkers deepen Kaplan and help us to understand the implications of his thought. Santayana's aid comes to us particularly from a small book entitled Platonism and the Spiritual Life. There, Santayana states, quote, that the values are for the Platonists not only ideals, but creative powers. In other words, values have power and are the vehicles of power. And if something or someone has power, it means that they make something happen. One might say that the values act through us to motivate our behavior. At a later point, Santayana continues, if the word real be used to mean whatever is most clear or important or nearest to the heart, such values would not only be real, but the most real. End of quote. Now, of course, I am not maintaining that Kaplan is a Platonist, but I do feel that Santayana helps us to understand Kaplan's most familiar formulation, God as the power that makes for salvation. I would like to propose that we talk of powers, plural, that make for salvation, understanding by this the primary ideals which constitute our ethical system. Kaplan maintains the reality and independence of ideals very often, as I have been saying. For him, the ideals are central to religion in general and Judaism in particular. The ideals move us and hence have power and hence have reality. But there is more. I want to propose that not only do the ideals have power, but that they collectively are what Kaplan means by God. And not only are we talking about something subjective, as in the moral ideals which we hold, but that the moral ideals are objective and are related to sources outside of us, which might be considered as the soul of the universe. The soul of the universe is God. Remember Kaplan's introduction to the prayer book.
Mel, 2-minute warning, okay?
Okay. The examples of these connections in Kaplan are many, and I want to end with a number of striking passages. This is reading text number 2, Dan.
Okay.
This is from Kaplan. At this point, I want to submit what I experience as the reality and presence of God, on the assumption that every normally constituted person is subject to the same experience. I refer to the will to make the most of life, the will to exploit to the utmost all its possibilities for growth and happiness. I cannot help regarding it as though it were a single beam of light radiating from inexhaustible source. That beam of light is the best in each of us. It is our personality. It is what we term I, the inexhaustible source of my will to make the most of life is God. It is the thou we hail and glorify each time we say, blessed art thou, O Lord our God. And he continues, we must be in active communion with God, of whom our best self, our selfless urge to make the most of life, is an infinitesimal but actual ray of energy. With this kavanah in mind, we should recite our benedictions and utter our praises of God. Let us grasp the full significance of the key word baruch, used in worship. It means to bless, and is a two-way word, for we bless God and we ask God to bless us. In the former case, it means that we glorify God. In the latter case, it means that God prospers. But there is, in the very twofold use of the term, the implication of mutuality, of God's needing man and man's needing God. This is Kaplan before he meets Heschel. God's needing man and man's needing God. In the words of the medieval poet, his glory is upon us and upon him, upon me and upon him. Last reading, July 1942. I resumed yesterday the practice of putting on tefillin. I did so not merely out of a nostalgia for Jewish atmosphere, but out of an urge to act out what I experienced as the presence of God. I simply contrasted continual mental turmoil in me as part of a universal process which I identify as God. Likewise, I cannot but think of the miracle that I identify my mind with its thousands and one currents of thought and emotion and will as a tiny wavelet of the ocean, of the infinite ocean, for which no name is more suitable than that of God. But merely to be aware of God is not enough. Is it not natural to do something which satisfies the urge to give expression to that awareness? Hence, to put on tefillin is the simplest thing to do under the circumstances. Thank you.
Shkala, wonderful. Thank you very much. We're now delighted to welcome Dr. Emily Filler, whose topic is The God of Liberal Democracy, Mordechai Kaplan's Pragmatic Theopolitics. And keep the questions coming.
I'm really grateful to be here with people. I'm very glad for the conversation. And I'm a bit in awe of the Kaplan Center for having put this together. The least I can do now is give a paper on Kaplan, which I will do. My chief text is Kaplan's short book, Judaism Without Supernaturalism, which was first published in 1958, so nearly 25 years after the first publication of his most famous work, Judaism as a Civilization. The book, broadly speaking, is concerned with the maintenance and perpetuation of a naturalist Judaism, and we'll talk a little about what that means, which for Kaplan, writing at mid-century, has necessary and distinctive features. I want to come with a set of questions around which this conference is based by focusing on Kaplan's mid-century account of the relationship between Jews and the nation state. So we'll take a bit of a political turn, particularly the liberal democratic nation state. Ultimately, I want to suggest a little provocatively that despite his famous thoroughgoing rejection of Jewish chosenness by a personal God, Kaplan evinces a conviction that modern Jews and liberal democratic states should, as it were, choose each other. Kaplan's identification of some foundational Jewish commitments and practices are, for him, able to create not only a more honest and spiritually edifying Judaism, but a better nation. For Kaplan, naturalist religion is not a rejection necessarily of all supernatural claims or any kind of divine revelation. And I'm grateful to Mel Scult for pointing this out. Nor are the traditional features of religiosity necessarily problematic in themselves. Even some obviously theological language like the invocation of God can find expression in naturalism properly understood. Kaplan describes religion as having three dimensions: belonging, believing, and experiencing. And as he says, he finds a correlate for each of these, their embodiment in polity, doctrine, and ritual. Now, the historical setting here in which Kaplan is careful to locate himself is very distinct from the setting in which he wrote Judaism as a Civilization. There, Kaplan asserted that religion based in supernatural or revelatory claims was clearly insufficient to sustain Jews and others in scientific modernity. For Jewish institutions to survive, let alone thrive, they must understand the demands of modernity, and Kaplan's response, of course, is what he calls civilization. But in 1958, Kaplan sets the scene in quite a different way. He still argues that while human culture is dominated by naturalism, it's now the case that religion is slow to catch on. And he writes, and I quote, "The concomitant of naturalism in culture is freedom, with its humane and this worldly spirit. The emphasis in all naturalistic thinking about the condition of man is on the possibilities rather than the limitations of his life. That radical change has taken place in the entire gamut of human living except in religion." But in the post-war era, something is different from Judaism as a civilization. Because religion, Kaplan says, is experiencing a kind of momentary and improbable upswing, what he calls the so-called religious upsurge. And the source of this uptick in American religious participation, both Jewish and non, is significant: the rise of Soviet communism. And this is the first quote on the text sheet. "Perhaps nothing that has occurred in recent decades has done so much to arouse an interest in religion as the fact that communism has filled the religious vacuum by making a religion of naturalism. Communism has worked out a three-dimensional religion of its own. It is a religion with a specific polity, doctrine, and experience. The rush to the churches and synagogues seems far safer than fascism as an escape from the fear of creeping communism, but what is to prevent that rush from growing into a galloping obscurantism which would make short shrift with democracy in all its ways?" Now, Kaplan asserts that the iron law of dialectical materialism is the basis of this doctrine, and while this is a common claim, I'm actually not sure this is really correct of the post-war Soviet Union. And Rebecca Alpert and others have written more extensively about Kaplan vis-a-vis Marxist economics. But in any case, what I want to note is that Kaplan has a new sociological location. Now he wants to make an argument about the virtues of naturalism as necessary for Jewish and state flourishing at a time when, first of all, the communist state, with what he calls a religion of naturalism, is a political and cultural antagonist of the United States. And second, and as a result, traditional institutional religious participation in the United States is actually enjoying a kind of defiant momentary renaissance. So this is quite a bit different from the setting in which he wrote Judaism as a Civilization. Unlike many of his contemporaries in the mainline Protestant denominations, who are apparently quite dismissive of the return to religion, Kaplan is not cynical. Not incognizant of the perhaps shallow theological roots of the present upsurge, Kaplan nevertheless sees this as a promising moment. It may be the wave, this is his quote, of a future indicating a new formation in the topography of the human spirit. It's with this that he calls for what he calls here kind of momentarily transnatural religion. Now, he rarely goes back to this phrase. He rarely uses the phrase otherwise. I agree with Malscott that it's not that descriptive in itself, but he does give a kind of account of it here. This is the second quote on the text sheet. Transnaturalism is that extension of naturalism which takes into account much that mechanistic or materialistic or positivist science is incapable of dealing with. And I think we should read in this him kind of throwing an elbow toward the Soviets. Transnaturalism reaches out into the domain where mind, personality, purpose, ideals, values, and meanings dwell. It has a language of its own, the language of simile, metaphor, and poetry. Transnaturalist religion beholds God in the fulfillment of human nature and not in the suspension of the natural order. Its function is not to help man overcome the hazards of nature, but to enable him to bring under control his inhumanity to his fellow man. Now, he does hasten to say that some of what he calls transnaturalism is already sort of in vogue under existentialism. But he's highly critical of existentialism, which he says is weighed down by a nostalgic hankering after the outlived supernaturalism. I think this sounds very Kaplanian. It is so fascinated by the element of absurdity or paradox in traditional doctrine as to discern in it nothing less than divine revelation. So too, he also rejects romanticism, which he critiques as, quote, setting a premium upon the untamed impulses and the unharnessed will, which has reached its climax in the deification of soil and blood. And this is obviously a reference to the Third Reich. In any case, supernaturalism here has the unfortunate potential to invite totalitarian political organization. But there can be a kind of naturalism that can take seriously, he says, personality, mind, purposes, ideals, values, and meanings. This is his account of transnaturalism. So my question is what this naturalism looks like, what it affirms, and what it believes in this very distinctive mid-century context. In response to this question, Kaplan begins to describe what he calls the universal aspect of Jewish religion. Now, he introduces this, and this is really important, by calling it the Jewish contribution to world order. Once Judaism is divested of some desiccated supernatural claims, it can do its part for the universal project. But what we see is that Kaplan's account of Judaism's universal aspect makes a rather more sweeping and subtly polemic claim. That is, Kaplan ultimately does not simply suggest that in the array of religious and secular contributions to democratic processes, Judaism also has something to offer. Rather, he suggests that Judaism's particular contributions are essential to the proper workings of democracy, that they are difficult to replicate from any other tradition, and that Jews as a collective serve a necessary and distinctive purpose. Kaplan's account of Judaism's universal aspects include not only prophetism, which he says illuminates the meaning of social justice, but also Torah, which he argues points the way, quote, to what is necessary to make social justice work. And it's important to note that although we sometimes use the phrase social justice in a more specific way, for him it refers broadly to the pursuit of a just and democratic society. When Kaplan describes these features as emerging from prophetism, we do not necessarily yet see them as Jewishly distinct or indispensably Jewish. But when Kaplan introduces the concept of Torah, he makes a more acute claim. The prophetic conviction of truth-telling and freedom from tyranny is not enough. As Kaplan says, quote, Judaism does not confine itself to dreaming beautiful dreams about the world as it might be. Its main concern is to bring the ideal from heaven down to earth.
Excuse me, Emily, do you need to scroll down? I'm not sure where you are on the...
So I will scroll down in just a minute.
Okay.
We'll come to the third quote about law. No, thank you. So what it is that Torah gives us is not easily suggested by or accessed through other religious or cultural traditions. For Kaplan, this is of course an essential need for modern nations, but it is not easily accessible elsewhere. Although the European Renaissance imparted to the West the ideal of education to the humanities, Kaplan ruthlessly concludes that, quote, the result was the dehumanization, which led to the devastating religious wars of the Middle Ages. So there goes the Renaissance. Modern scientific education, meanwhile, has led to the growing barbarization of man. But the Jewish notion of Torah has, quote, lifted education to the level of religion. And here we come to the third quote on the sheet. The second means by which the Torah seeks to have the prophetic ideals translated into action is law. Torah, as law, is synonymous with constitutionalism, government by law in contrast with government by men. The individual human being, however well-intentioned, requires the support of his fellows to live up to his own better self. That support he and his fellows fashion when they merge their wills into one collective will which is articulated in law. The Torah, though not subscribing to the doctrine of original sin as professed in non-Jewish theology, recognizes the proneness of man to evil. Against that proneness, man needs a stronger safeguard than abstract moral ideals. That safeguard can only be law. To get the full significance of this Torah conception of law, one has to contrast that conception with the one propounded by Paul in his epistle to the Romans. Now, it's useful to note that in this context, it's not really necessary for us to consensus on the accuracy of Kaplan's characterization, historical or otherwise. What is significant is that although Kaplan frames his general discussion as humbly describing some universal aspects of Judaism that can contribute to the present democratic project, Kaplan's account of Torah seems to be essentially and uniquely necessary for democracy. He makes this more clear when he invokes in comparison the law as described in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans in the New Testament. And now I've given you a bit of Paul as well. Consider this from the second chapter of the book of Romans. Circumcision is indeed of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law, will not their circumcision be regarded as circumcision? And then in verse 29, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual, not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others, but from God. Now, importantly, although this ambivalent account of law is certainly important in Paul's letter, Kaplan could likely find passages not dissimilar in the Hebrew Bible and the prophetic literature. Given that, it's even more notable that he takes care to contrast the Jewish approach, which will make democracy, with an approach he explicitly associates with Christianity. The New Testament passage is not a thoroughgoing rejection of law. What Kaplan rejects in Romans is what he perceives to be the contingency of law's value. Law, in Paul's formulation, is not of inherent value, and it pales next to the internal workings of one's own heart. Kaplan, however, is deeply skeptical of this confidence that law may be transcended without disastrous consequences. Goodwill is futile when not enforced by law, as he argues, quote, the utter collapse of the League of Nations, upon which the hopes of mankind were for a time centered, is irrefutable proof of the truth implied in the method of Torah, that good intentions, which are not backed by enforceable law, are bound to be frustrated. We see then, I think, that Kaplan's evaluation of what liberal democracy needs is not easily found across traditions. Historically, he says, attempts at locating these values have gone very wrong or fallen far short. That is, Judaism's ostensible contribution to the universal democratic project is far more essential than the language of contribution might suggest. And that's not all. the Jewish people themselves are also an indispensable part of democracy. Jews are themselves what he calls a, quote, barometer of the democratic process. As he says, quote, the Jews were the one group in the Western world that was the most conspicuous beneficiary of the humaneness, the reasonableness, the sweetness and light which at first characterized free enterprise democracy. The fate of Jewry has been an infallible barometer of the fate of democracy. Again, the question here is not whether his evaluation is historically correct per se. What is notable is that once again, Jews are not simply described as contributors to democracy, but as foundational markers of whether democracy is functioning at all. And so his conclusion in this regard is, let's say, suggestive. This is the last quote on your sheet. Kaplan asserts, quote, it is thus the destiny of the Jews to warn the world that unless the forces which have given rise to mass democracy be reckoned with in a spirit of understanding and channeled within the embankment of inner freedom, reason, justice, and peace, they will bring on a deluge that will sweep away the human race. Now, Kaplan does not use this word destiny so often, and he doesn't elaborate on it here. But for a thinker committed in many regards to historical contingency, the idea of Jews having a destiny is at least notable. Liberal democracy for Kaplan needs the Jews, and of course the Jews need liberal democracy for obvious reasons. They are, if you'll permit me, in a kind of conditional covenant with one another. That is, they don't simply help one another, but they require one another, and in Kaplan's terms, cannot flourish now without one another. And they are in a distinctive relationship in this regard. I don't mean to suggest, by conclusion, that for Kaplan, liberal democracy in this text is God. I do observe, however, that the relationship between Jews and Judaism on the one hand and democracy on the other is described in a paradigm that has some significant echoes of the covenantal relationship between the Jews and God. It's also notable that in seemingly locating Judaism and Jews as a distinctive and indispensable element of making a modern and rational polity, Kaplan joins a group of Jewish philosophers whom we would really not call naturalists: Moses Mendelssohn, Samson Raphael Hirsch, Hermann Cohen, and others. Across very significant differences, Kaplan joins this group in locating Jews and Judaism at the center of the liberal democratic process, and Jews and Judaism and democracy in what I call, at least a little suggestively, a relationship, a covenantal relationship, or a relationship of chosenness with one another. And with that, I thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Ah, that was terrific. Thank you, Emily. Coming right out of something you just said, Emily, but this was originally asked of Mel, but you're obviously welcome to comment. How does Kaplan's involvement with Hermann Cohen and Jewish neo-Kantianism play out in his understanding of the mind and ideas? Is Kaplan a Kantian, and if so, to what extent? And maybe either one of you, I think, who wants to comment, or both.
Mel, would you like to start off?
Let me make sure Mel is unmuted. One sec. Okay, Mel? No, we can't hear you. You are unmuted, I think, but we can't hear you.
Mel is muted, actually.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry. You are correct. Hold on.
There we go.
Okay.
Kaplan's Kantianism goes back to his teacher, Felix Adler, who studied with Hermann Cohen in the 1870s and was basically and ethically, Felix Adler was a neo-Kantian, and Kaplan studied with him for 3 years at Columbia and was deeply influenced by him. Kaplan also wrote a book called The Purpose and Meaning of Jewish Existence, which dealt with the philosophy of Hermann Cohen. It's a very interesting book because he has a text of Hermann Cohen's major work, above the line and his own comments below the line, although there were articles which were published after the book came out, which criticized Kaplan's understanding of Hermann Cohen.
Great. So Vicky Vossen asked, and I'm going to paraphrase and summarize a bit, reflecting back on her time as a student at JTS in the 1970s and the nature of the faculty then, she's wondering as to Kaplan's decision to resume the practice of putting on tefillin in the morning, whether you, Mel, think it's possible that he was trying to make a point to his faculty colleagues who viewed him as entirely, in some cases, entirely an apicorus.
Well, I think it was a very personal act. I mean, in this case, I think he was proud of the fact that he was observant, but his observance was deeply personal. I mean, he wore the Arba Confuss, for example, and he dyed them purple.
The seat under his clothes.
Excuse me?
Seat under his clothes, fringes under his clothes. We have a very pluralistic audience.
Oh.
Go ahead. Sorry, you just referred to Arba Confuss.
And in Kaplan's 90th birthday, when Heschel spoke, it was in 1971, Heschel mentioned that he also had dyed his tzitzis of the Arba Confuss in purple, and so they shared that together.
Great. Next question. I promised Elizabeth Kaplan this morning I would at least give you the chance, Mel, to comment on her question. What do you suppose or think Kaplan's understanding of the patriarch Abraham? I always say the patriarch because we're not talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel here. The patriarch Abraham and his covenant as reported in Torah.
Well, Kaplan had 4 daughters, and he said that was the reason for his embracing of the bat mitzvah. Kaplan spoke in favor of the 19th Amendment in 1917 and 18, which gave the vote to women. There's a lot of indications of Kaplan's support of the rights of women in the...
No, I'm sorry, you may have misheard. I said he totally different question about what how he understood the story, the biblical story in Bereshit of Abraham as our patriarch and his covenant with God.
Well, he reinterpreted the covenant. I mean, the covenant is basic to Jewish theology, as certainly Eugene Borowitz has indicated, and Kaplan needed to reconstruct it. And what he said was that the obligation to follow the laws of justice is what constitutes the essence of being Jewish, that the ethical system is the main content of the covenant, and Jews are obligated to that. And that's what constitutes for him the meaning of the covenant.
Thank you. Rabbi Dr. Gordon Tucker asks Mel candidly to comment on this thought. I asked this, I'm quoting, I asked this not to question how enduring were the thoughts expressed in Kaplan's diary in Kaplan's fullest worldview. I pretty much feel in this case they are. Instead, I want to raise the general methodological question about treating diary entries as the best key to laying out a thinker's developed thought. What one says in communing with oneself is quite different, or maybe from what decides is sufficiently examined to be presentable to the world through publication. Fair question, you've thought about it, I know.
Well, I remember somewhere Emerson or Thoreau commented on the value of what a person has written himself to himself. That's what Thoreau called his diary. I think it's a complicated issue, but his statement, you know, that he felt this was too radical for his rabbinical students at the seminary and too complicated for the congregation, kind of answers the question to me. And I think it's what one has in the diary is the record of his search. Very personal, very week to week, year to year, for meaning, for understanding what it means to be a Jew, what it means to be an individual, and it's very compelling, and in my mind, is more compelling than his published work.
Zach Mann has a question for Emily. Somebody's unmuted. For Emily, if you can hear me. Can you say a bit more about your method, which allows you to read Kaplan and potentially other American Jewish thinkers theopolitically, when the impulse to do so has not always been there? Why and how can we read more non-statist thinkers as having a politics?
Sure, thank you. I think that's an important question, actually, probably across the conference. In this case, I mean, Kaplan makes it a little easy. I mean, I sort of cheated a little by looking at Judaism without supernaturalism chiefly, when his focus really is on liberal democracy. And in fact, the second half, which I didn't really talk about specifically, is about what he envisions being the particular Jewish contribution of liberal democracy to the new Israeli state. So in that case, it actually becomes quite easy for him. I don't think I would imagine that we could understand American Jewish thinkers outside of a political realm. American Jewish thinkers have always sort of understood themselves to be negotiating a body of political demands that were or were not sort of felicitously related to Judaism. What I think is interesting, in your question about thinkers who might sort of more generally understand themselves as non-statist, and here I think the kind of obvious question is someone like Martin Buber, whose relationship to states was I don't know, ambivalent. And yet there's actually been a good amount of work lately about Martin Buber as a theopolitical thinker. And I'd point especially to Sam Brody's book, Martin Buber's Theopolitics. So I think actually that at the very least, let's say in this political moment, I think it's probably difficult to read a thinker making claims about action in the world without understanding that to have immediate political and statist implications.
Great.
If I can chime in, I found Emily's paper very valuable in emphasizing Kaplan's commitment to democracy, which really is solidified by his reaction to Nazism in the Second World War. But more importantly, Kaplan and I had a very rich correspondence when I met him, and he wanted me to write a book with him. And he started to write me very, very often about his thought. And it had to do primarily with this issue of law, of the Torah as constitutional law. And so this was in the early 70s, but it obviously begins in the 50s with what you're pointing out, Emily, and it stays with him.
Right.
And what I think is important there is that he not only sort of calls attention to law in a particular way, but he goes out of his way to make sure the reader knows that there are other potential traditions from which one might glean a theopolitics that don't understand law this way, and that their way has a bad track record. I mean, I actually found the book, which I hadn't read in a while, quite notably polemical and a bit distinctive, which is what sort of like allowed me to sort of make the sort of chutzpahdik or sort of galling suggestion about sort of liberal democracy has chosen this. But I do think that he sort of does this to himself. He sort of makes clear that he wants to call attention to a particular idea of law that is distinctive to Judaism.
So the last question before we go back to our speakers, starting with Emily, but Mel, you're welcome to comment too. How much do you think Kaplan, I'm going to paraphrase again, this is from Eric Mendelson, how much do you think the fact that Kaplan focused to a great extent on America and Israel in terms of the Jewish communities there, and didn't so much deal with the rest of the diaspora, that is Europe, Central and South America, or South Africa, had an impact on his thought and work?
Sure. I mean, briefly, I actually think it's a really notable question. I mean, it's notable to me that in this mid-century work, when he makes reference to Europe, he's always, almost always lurking behind there is either Soviet communism or the Third Reich. So to some degree, I actually think he thinks of Europe as a kind of like scorched earth. Like he imagines America for reasons of the kind of circumstances of its founding, and then Israel for its sort of newness and kind of vision, which he imagines to have a lot of potential in the way that Europe does it. Now, the South African case is a really interesting one. That maybe somebody else could speak to a little bit more. But I think that he does think there's something about Europe which has actually sort of demonstrated how it is that the idea of democracy can go wrong. And I'm not sure that he thinks that can be precisely be retrieved.
Right. Mel, did you want to add a last word there before we go on?
Well, it reminds me, what you just said, Emily, reminds me of Kaplan's earliest statements about democracy, which come from articles he wrote in 1917 and 18, in which he talks about the threat of everybody having freedom, and that they would abandon the Jewish past because of that freedom. And that changed radically in the late 30s and 40s, when he began to see how the democratization of the Jewish community could be used to strengthen it. And that meant the democratization of Jewish consciousness in terms of democratic values, and reading that into Jewish ritual.
Great.
Yeah.
So it's now a pleasure to introduce Dr. Nadav S. Berman, who is going to speak. His remarks are titled "Some Remarks on Pantheism, Gnosticism, and the Challenges of Religious Naturalism." I want to thank Nadav in particular because his April 2019 Pragmatism workshop at Yale, in a sense, is what originally gave birth to the idea of doing this conference. So thank you, Nadav, for that.
So, shalom to all of you from Jerusalem. And even though it's, at least in closet Kaplan conference, I'll speak mostly on more general topics. But actually, Emily, your wonderful paper is maybe a good jumping board to what I'm going to speak about. So thank you, Dan, for organizing this mind-provoking conference, and Mel and Eric, and for the invitation to speak. And thank you all for attending. I look forward to the Q&A to discuss your comments. Sorry for speaking too fast. As an Israeli, it should be a particular sin, but I hope that it will work. Just a second. Okay, so a broad definition of religious naturalism, or RN, is taken by or from Jerome Stone, and then you sent it back then about religious naturalism being a set of beliefs and attitudes that affirm that there are religious aspects in this world that can be understood within a naturalistic framework. This is a thin definition, and I'll try to dig deeper. And I want to allude to Art Green's comments on environmentalism. And as we face a global environmentalist crisis, religious naturalism actually bears far-reaching consequences. There are many important religious naturalist authors. Some of them are speaking here, and it's really an honor to participate in this conference. And obviously there are many versions of religious naturalism, Kaplan being a central one. To sustain a nature-friendly religious naturalism, however, I think that there's a need to consider some of the difficult questions that actually political theology is considering in recent decades. And maybe that's a good time to consider Kaplan in this regard. And I'll step from St. Paul to Gnosticism in this talk, and hopefully it will contribute to the deliberation of the environmentalist challenges. And the basic aim of this paper is basically to invite religious naturalists to reflect on their immediacy or nearness to pantheism. So this conference poses a serious question: do religious naturalists really believe in God? The question seemingly assumes that God and the human belief in God are somewhat given or fixed, and that in some sense there is only one road ahead, and either it is taken or not. In this paper, I wish to challenge this presumed assumption that Art Green actually challenged already by proposing a rather David Humean or Alasdair MacIntyrean interrogation of the following manner: a belief in which God and which type of belief. As I hope to demonstrate, or at least to introduce the thought about, these questions are vital in order to defend a sustainable or better form of religious naturalism, neo-Aristotelian, neo-biblical, or other, that acknowledges pantheism's merits without ignoring its flaws. The generic type of religious naturalism that I have in mind when using this term is pantheist-laden religious naturalism. Forgive me for the abbreviations. It's also very late in the evening in Israel. For you, it should be more comfortable. And in this paper, I wish to problematize some kinship between pantheist-laden religious naturalism and pantheism, but also between pantheist-laden religious naturalism and Gnosticism. This exploration is required given the profound shift between the Enlightenment temper that Spinoza ultimately expressed and between the Gnostic urge, which is so or seems so potent in modernism. Even though my intention here is to explore religious naturalism, its relationship with pantheism and Gnosticism is wedded to the particularities of Jewish thought. This is also a topic for or a theme of this conference and dear to the people here. And we shall say some things about it and hopefully also about Kaplan. This paper is ultimately inviting religious naturalists to reflect on pantheism and Gnosticism, Bekitzur, in summary. So the paper proceeds as follows. Section 1 will provide a working definition, controversial, please challenge me, for the terms pantheism and Gnosticism, and remark on the peculiar tensions that were created by their intersection with Protestantism and modernism. Section 2 will consider the ideational revolving door, some diffusion between pantheism and Gnosticism concerning the themes of evil and reason. And this is a bird's eye view, or drone eye view, as we can say today. Section 3 will ask whether Jewish naturalism or Jewish religious naturalism, whatever you will, can dwell within the straits of pantheism and Gnosticism or thrive. And the epilogue will revisit the ramifications for how we think about nature. So let's move on. Let us start by defining the main terms, two terms under consideration, and forgive me for the inevitable generalization involved in this endeavor. It is only ideal types. So pantheism is a famous idea, but let's say a few words. Benedict de Spinoza had formulated this idea back in the in 1677. It's a posthumous book, Ethics, very famous, even though the signifier pantheism was coined only later by the deist John Tallet. Pantheism is a complex concept, yet it has a catchy philosophical motto: Deus sive natura, God or nature. God is the world and God is identical with the world. This idea famously influenced Kaplan, as many other thinkers. And the biblical God, though, the personal God, seemingly is in some existential risk. And at least in Spinoza, seems to be ruled out. in Spinoza's mind, the cosmos is ultimately comprised of only one substance, and there are two modes, extension and thoughts, and infinite properties and entities, but the cosmos is ultimately one. And the appeal of pantheism for religious naturalists is evident. An all-inclusive deity, which is the all-inclusive nature, the religious and the nature components are thus neatly merged. However, many critics accused Spinoza and later Spinozistic thinkers as being atheists, and more obviously as being deterministic. And this is really in a nutshell. The next term under consideration is Gnosticism. Is also a complicated concept, but differently from pantheism, Gnosticism is quite resistant to a simple definition packing and is highly disputed among its scholars. So when using the term Gnostic to its declensions in this paper, I draw chiefly on Hans Jonas's conceptualization of this term in his book, The Gnostic Religion, and Bar Guzi is going to speak about Jonas tomorrow. Look forward to hear you, Bar. Historically speaking, Gnosticism originated as a heretic religious movement in late antiquity of the East, near, middle, far, and its most famous figure was a 2nd century Marcion, whose books were lost, but his intellectual rebellion against the Mosaic creator God was documented thanks to Marcion's critique. Tertullian and later Christian authors who denunciated Marcion. The discovery of Nag Hammadi in the 20th century famously created a new wave of interest around the concept of Gnosticism, and the disputes are really profound. According to Jonas, at least that I adhere to his definition on this topic, it seems to me helpful at least. Gnosticism is saying or proposing or stating the following arguments or propositions. The world is basically created by an inferior God. The Gnostics call it, or him or her, Yaldabaoth, or Demiurge, and there are many archons. Humans are being thrown into this hostile world. The human person is alien to his or her corporality, but nevertheless able to liberate from this worldly prison. This idea is derived from Plato. I mean, there are many diffusions in late antiquity, but this is Gnosticism that we're speaking about now. You all know Summa Sema. But Gnosticism took it to the extreme, and the real God, Barbelo, is totally other, inaccessible, and basically indifferent to this world. The normative Gnostic dictate is paradoxically anti-normative. According to Jonas, is nihilistic and tends to the both poles of libertinism and asceticism. So this is Gnosticism in a nutshell, and I cannot enter here all the complications about various figures and schools within Gnosticism. I'm not an expert of Gnosticism, but it seems to be an important enough topic to engage. But there are many arguments about the Mandaeans, the Marcionites, the Manichaeans, the Valentinian, later medieval Gnostic groups. And Jonas's definition seems narrow enough because it's specific. It's not only that you should appreciate knowledge in order to be considered Gnostic. It seems like a good, holistic, detailed definition. And Gnosticism, according to Jonas and others, Buber that was mentioned by Emily, was detected as existing also in modernity. One of the examples is Kierkegaard. There's a striking citation from Kierkegaard that at least I thought is eye-opening. But in any case, Jonas, Buber, and others identified Gnostic themes in Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Camus, and others. And these continental thinkers, that perhaps this is the reason why Kaplan was so happy to leave them behind, all share what we can term as exclusionary ontology. Heaven and earth, mind and matter cannot coexist, and one of them is either illusionary, for example, God in Nietzsche's opinion, or worthless. For example, worldly existence in Kierkegaard's mind. The profound complexity of Gnosticism stems from the fact that it has some ideational overlap with St. Paul, aforementioned Paul the Apostle. The stark contrast between heaven and earth and between love and law made the Christian message catchy, while setting a rigid boundary between Christianity and Judaism, but it threatened to cut the ethical prophetic branch on which Christianity sits. And it seems that Kaplan was concerned by that in some ways. Hence the ongoing attempts to moderate Pauline radicalism and the battle of proto-Orthodox Christianity against Gnosticism. It seems that the founding of Protestantism in the 16th century and the secularization trajectories of later modernity unleashed ambivalent energies. On the one hand, these energies nourished the development of democratic values and humane equality, but also they seem to fuel some nihilistic Gnostic currents. Again, Gnostic, at least in Jonas's concepts. As we learned from Benjamin Lazier's book, God Interrupted, Gnosticism re-emerged intensively or exploded after World War I, replacing pragmatism with basically Gnosticism. And this is the point where I found Gnosticism particularly important, because my dissertation was on Kaplan, Hirschensohn and Berkowitz, and pragmatism. And this contradiction, this shift seems striking to me. And there are many forms of pantheism, panentheism, I'm not speaking about here, and reductive pantheism seems especially akin to new atheism that we find. In any case, the questions that I want to stress is what can we say about this intersection between pantheism and Gnosticism that is very surprisingly not so much addressed, in part because Jonas's definition is not so popular. It is very popular among certain scholars, but not among all of them. And what can we learn about this seeming, not identity, but perhaps similarities that we will consider now about religious naturalism? So some affinities between pantheism and Gnosticism are really challenging for religious naturalists, because it seems that there are some slippery slopes between pantheism and Gnosticism that makes these concepts shaky and fluid and interesting in an interesting way, but also in some problematic ways, according to Jonas and Feuglin and other scholars, Buber, that were concerned by the reappearance of Gnosticism in modernity. And it seems that both ideologies or intellectual movements, pantheism and Gnosticism, are pushing away from the realm of possibility and chance into the realms of determinism on the one hand and contingency on the other hand. And the main road of the pragmatist acknowledgement of possibility and how we can deal with that, if you saw Moshe Halbertal's new book about the birth of doubt, there's a full issue in rabbinic Judaism around that, and pantheism seems to push towards a deterministic pole, and Gnosticism seems to push towards the contingency pole. And there are some observations to be made about the way they are moving, how pantheism is very deterministic, but when you consider Spinoza, you see that in the details, there is actually a lot of voluntarism and contingency that you can't really account for. Spinoza is saying this is basically God and everything is God. But teleology is undermined. Human freedom, of course, seems to be threatened, as Yitzhak Melamed and others are commenting on Spinoza. And Gnosticism, on the other hand, seems to be very open and fully contingent, but some dogmatic principles are out there. For example, Albert Camus, assumptions that human beings are thrown, right? And Heidegger, why assuming that in the first place, maybe God is not so humiliating us? So there are interesting questions to be asked here that I can't enter into. I just try to propose that there are some revolving doors here between Gnosticism and pantheism that should be considered. Again, this is really an introductory call for research. And there is a certain crispiness of the good and evil, meaning in Spinoza, things seem to be very, very good. And evil is really not out there, it's just an illusion. But things are not as stable as Spinoza tried to convey. And there's a slippery slope of rationality, which turns to be or seems to be, once you check, for example, Spinoza's attitude towards foreigners, others. There are interesting works about Spinoza and the Auschwitz mind in Israeli society, some provocative works. And there are hard questions to be asked about Spinoza that I think religious naturalists should consider seriously. Yes, air condition is always a good contribution to religious naturalism. And I want to propose that by ignoring Gnosticism, pantheism or pantheist-laden religious naturalists runs the risk of being optimistically blind. And there seems to be a narrow bridge between the goodness and evil in Spinoza. In Gnosticism, it's more obvious that the world picture is dualistic through and through, and the world is conceived as bad, as inherently bad. As you could see in the slide from Tertullian in previous slide. And I have to go ahead. So I'll just mention that, again, there is a basic problem about evil that maybe was mentioned earlier. And it seems that there is an ecosystem, meaning you can deny the realness of evil, but evil and the problem of evil is there. And a good example is the agape of St. John's, meaning if God is only love, and then what happens to evil is a good question, and often Satanism is inflating. So these are just very random thoughts about pantheism and Gnosticism. And the basic problem is that the commitment to rationality and to reason giving is in Spinoza. It is very straightforwardly declared, but in fact things seem more shaky in this regard. And absurdity, which is very at first at the front in Gnosticism, is also appearing in pantheism, and Spinoza's conatus is also problematic in this regard, and we can't elaborate on that now. I'll just make a short remark about the place of nature, which this is a note by a comment by Jonas about the lack of account for the philosophy of nature in existentialism, in Heidegger and others. And Spinoza's conatus is again, these are rough generalizations, and there is much work to be done here. But again, I want to stress the problem of the place of nature, basically in modern thought, but specifically in pantheism and in Gnosticism. And the question I want to pose after this slide will be about Jewish thought, and I think I'll have to finish then. Basically, pantheism is monistic and reductionist, whereas Gnosticism is dualistic, but both are radically nominalist. And that seems to be a problem for normative systems. And if religious naturalism were to promote responsible human agency, there seems to be a place for thinking deeper, harder about pantheism and Gnosticism. And very, very briefly, I just say that, how much time do I have, Dan?
1 minute.
1 minute. That the Jewish naturalism that I think can be found similar to what I call normative-laden Jewish tradition. Sorry for the abbreviations of synagogue Judaism to its branches. I think synagogue Judaism is fairly naturalistic in some regards, and the question about the relationship between Judaism or normative-laden Jewish tradition and Gnosticism is a huge topic. I followed Yosef Dan, Eliezer Schweid, Moshe Idel to some extent, who thinks that there is that Gershom Sholom's equation between Gnosticism and Kabbalah is simplistic. And I hope that this presentation, which basically tries to convey that pantheism is more complex and tied to Gnosticism in some ways that should be considered more deeply, this axis is worthy of consideration in the context of religious naturalism. And Mordecai Kaplan is one example, and there are others. And thank you all for listening. I'm happy to.
Yes, you've given us obviously an enormous amount to think about, some of which will come up again tomorrow as we have discussions specifically of Spinoza and of Hans Jonas's own thought. So with that, last but very much not least, we welcome Rabbi Dr. William Plevin, whose talk is entitled Epistemology or Poetics, Martin Buber and Neil Gilman on Myth.
Hi. Yeah, epistemology or poetics. Did I, yeah, I kept on thinking about different titles for this, as I'll talk about in a minute. So maybe I messed it up when I typed it out one place and put it on the other. Who knows? But I'll address the title actually. So all sorts of confusions about that will hopefully be illuminated. Here we are at a conference about naturalism and with the Kaplan Center, and there has been so much talk about Heschel, and that pleases me greatly. It surprises me too, but it also forms a wonderful way of entering into part of what I want to do, which is to honor my teacher Neil Gilman with this paper, because he was both a student of Kaplan's and a student of Heschel's, and wrestled with their thought in various ways. I will just mention that, and by the way, I should say I really appreciated all the papers from the first session and thought about them in connection to what I'm going to be saying here, and I may say something briefly about that on the way. I will just mention briefly, I want to thank, from a long time ago, both Mel Skult and Art Green for their contributions to a book I edited in Neil's honor called Personal Theology, which is available. So if people are interested in these conversations further, that book and Neil's and Art
going into the chat right now.
Right. Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah. So Art's papers and Mel's paper are very generative in these kinds of discussions as well. So one of the great regrets that a person can have is that they did not get a chance to have more conversations with a loved one, a friend, or a teacher who has passed away. And so today I'm mindful of the many conversations that I've now missed with my teacher, Neil Gilman, who died close to 3 years ago. I know his daughter, Debbie, is joining with us. I just want to mention her briefly. And And this paper is my incomplete way of continuing a conversation that I was blessed to have with him many times, mostly when I was much younger, and also when I desperately needed it. And I am always grateful to him for those conversations. The core of those conversations is about something very basic. What do we mean when we speak about God? Gilman's major concern as a teacher was that each student should have a clear, confident answer to this question. And my paper here is not just a response to his writings, but to his many years of being my teacher, whether in real life, on paper, or deeply rooted in my memory. I want to begin by expressing, I guess I was going to say hesitation, but now it's confusion about the title that I've given, because I thought I had said metaphysics or poetics, but epistemology or poetics is really probably more accurate. I draw this title from a passage from Neil Gilman's essay, Knowing God, from 1999, which offers his clearest statement on the topic of religious epistemology. As he says in the opening lines, religious epistemology is his burning theological and philosophical issue. In that essay, Gilman explains the issue of religious epistemology as follows, and this is the first quote that I've shared on the screen here. Are our theological claims knowledge claims, that is, capable of falsification and verification, of being true and false? Are they factual claims? Do they tell us something that is out there, beyond us, beyond our perceiving apparatus? Or are they poetry, that is, purely subjective expressions of personal feelings or wish projections? Or is there some alternative between these two polar positions? I in no way demean the value of poetry, but I have stubbornly resisted the notion that theology is only poetry. So if we use metaphysics or epistemology to refer to Gilman's interest in having our language about God be factual and falsifiable, being something out there and beyond us, and we use poetics to refer to the view that Gilman resists, the idea that theological language is only, and I emphasize only, subjective or projective, it's important to recognize that when Gilman poses this choice, he's not really saying that it has to be one or the other. That is, he does not think that theology needs to completely eschew poetics. On the contrary, the central concern of Gilman's project, as I understand it, is to show how the poetics of traditional theological language could continue to have spiritual power for modern Jews. In doing this, he wrestles with how to understand theological language as having both spiritual poetics and metaphysical significance within a naturalistic framework. This is the struggle at the heart of Gilman's religious epistemology. To accomplish this balancing act, Gilman draws on the concept of myth, which he understands, and this is the second quote, as a set of metaphors systematized and extended into a coherent structure of meaning. For Gilman, our knowledge about God is no different than our knowledge of ordinary objects, because all knowledge claims are justified within a framework of linguistic practices that forms an interpretive structure for discussing both ordinary objects and more complex realities. And all the words we use to describe all of these external realities are created by us, by human beings, even if the objects to which they refer are not. Myths, in the sense Gilman uses them, are a particular kind of interpretive pattern rooted in ancient cultural narratives and religious practices. But they point to a reality beyond themselves. To invoke his phrasing, we don't invent God, we discover God and invent the myths and metaphors. Moreover, Gilman insists that this way of thinking about theological language does not require what he calls a dual epistemology, meaning one way of thinking about theological knowledge and a different way of thinking about other forms of empirical or scientific knowledge. He points out that we often speak about, seeing or knowing things that are actually dynamic patterns. His favorite examples that come across in his writings are the passing game of a basketball team, the ego of Freudian theory, and the quark of atomic physics. For Gilman, saying that we know something about God is similar to saying that we know something about the Knicks passing game, a person's ego, and the properties of a quark. And I should just mention that I believe that he's referring to the Knicks passing game of the early 1970s. So it's a little bit dated, just in terms of using basketball as a contemporary and professional basketball as a reference point. And despite important differences, Gilman's use of the term myth brings to mind the work of Martin Buber. While Gilman talked a great deal about Heschel, of course, in his work, I think Buber, as well as Franz Rosenzweig's work, and their spirit really do hover over Gilman's theological work as well. What I want to do first is to show some parallels in their use of the term myth while highlighting important differences. Where Gilman insists on epistemology, Buber, it turns out, evades epistemology. But what are the consequences of this difference? Then I want to show that when it comes to the question of what we mean when we talk about God, Gilman and Buber actually both draw on the Jewish language of unity and wholeness, echad, God's oneness. I will end by sharing some reflections about what these points of convergence and divergence between Buber and Gilman might mean for the project of religious naturalism. The term myth does not appear as prominently in Buber's work as it does in Gilman's, but Buber does suggest that term could be used in a way that is consistent to his approach to reading biblical literature. In Buber's essay, Biblical Leadership, he uses the term myth to describe biblical narratives. And this is the next quotation, which I'm scrolling down to now. I have nothing against calling these biblical narratives myths and sagas, as long as we remember that myths and sagas are essentially memories which are actually conveyed from person to person. In his important essay, The Man of Today in the Jewish Bible, Buber presents this understanding of biblical narratives as an alternative to two problematic ones. The first understands these narratives as figurative language, merely metaphorical and allegorical, what Gilman means by just poetry. A second position views these narratives as telling of a supernatural event. Now, Buber states, and this is the, actually, I don't have this on the sheet. Buber states that if that were the case, man of today, in deciding to accept the Bible, would have to make a sacrifice of the intellect that would cut his life inseparably in two, provided he does not want to lapse into the habitual, lazy acceptance of something he does not really believe. Buber explains that his own approach is to treat biblical narratives as, quote, the verbal trace of a natural event. And here we are on the next quotation, i.e. of an event that took place in the world of the senses common to all men and fitted into connections that the senses can perceive. Buber goes on to explain that the assemblage that experienced this event experienced it as revelation vouchsafed to them by God and preserved it as such in the memory of generations, an enthusiastic, spontaneously formative memory. And then in a passage very reminiscent and close to Gilman's work, Buber states that experience undergone in this way is not self-delusion on the part of the assemblage. It is what they see, what they recognize and perceive with their reason. For natural events are the carriers of revelation, and revelation occurs when he who witnesses the event and sustains it experiences the revelation it contains. This means that he listens to that which the voice sounding forth from this event wishes to communicate to him its witness, to his constitution, to his life, to his sense of duty. What Gilman and Buber share, it seems to me, is their insistence that theological language, on the one hand, need not be understood as historically or metaphysically literal, and on the other hand, should not be understood as merely subjective. The concept of myth offers both of them a kind of middle ground in which mythic language points to a reality beyond itself without that language being a straightforward or literal account of that reality. However, when Gilman and Buber use the term myth, the reality that the myth points to is a different one. When Buber uses terms like experience, the senses, and natural, it is tempting to place him in the naturalist camp, but I don't think that label quite fits. True, he does reject supernaturalistic theological interpretation. However, when Buber speaks about natural events here, he basically means historical events. Biblical narratives don't have to be accurate records of historical events, but he insists that these narratives are anchored in historical events that really happened. They reflect the spiritual, enthusiastic reactions of the participants to these events that are preserved in the form of what he calls memory. Buber, more in keeping with modern biblical studies, uses the term myth to identify a particular kind of literary text. But unlike many scholars in that field, he insists that these myths are rooted in real historical events, the exodus of Israel from Egypt, most importantly. The power of Buber's approach is that it roots the Bible's theological language in a visceral spiritual experience of reality, historical reality. For Buber, Jewish religious texts preserve a unique spiritual language for how we too might experience everyday events or major historical events as revelatory encounters with the divine. In an interesting way, Gilman's approach to myth is much more flexible when it comes to the historical background of biblical narratives. I recall speaking with Gilman after Rabbi David Wolpe gave a much discussed sermon stating that the Exodus from Egypt may not have ever happened. This was back in 2001. And that sermon drew significant backlash from congregants as well as some press attention. Note that what upset people who heard Wolpe's sermon was not that he was denying supernatural miracles, but rather that he was denying the ordinary secular history of their ancestors being slaves under Egyptian rule and then fleeing to the land of Canaan. In other words, those who objected to the sermon thought about the matter much like Buber did, at least in the sense that their fidelity to the text was not in its literal historical truth, but to a more historically believable version of events. Gilman, as I recall, was glad that Wolpe raised the issue, but wondered what was taking everyone so long to recognize that Jewish theology needed to confront the possibility that many cherished biblical stories did not have the kernel of historical truth that many American Jews believed they had. In effect, I think what Gilman was saying was that his theological approach was already here, well equipped to address this problem. Put another way, this is why he had written Sacred Fragments more than a decade earlier. But as we have seen, while Gilman's theology does not depend on the historical background of biblical events, he does insist that theological language tells us something about the world beyond our own wishes, desires, or projections. Indeed, in Sacred Fragments, Gilman deploys the terminology of myth to explain his position on Revelation in a chapter titled, "What Really Happened?" And that's a question mark, what really happened? Ultimately, I think Gilman's approach to Revelation is a way to sidestep the question of the chapter. We don't know what really happened, but we do have the Bible and later Jewish literature and liturgy as a repository of Jewish theological insight. For Gilman, the Jewish myth is the larger totality of meanings within this literature as they shape Jewish religious beliefs and practices. As he puts it in Sacred Fragments, and now getting to the next quotation here, myths are intrinsic to communities. In fact, myths create communities. When they assume narrative form, they recount the community's master story, explaining how that community came into being. What distinguishes it from other communities, how it understands its distinctive history and destiny, what constitutes its unique value system. A myth provides a community with its distinctive raison d'etre. Where Buber uses myth to identify a literary genre, Gilman uses the term as an anthropologist would to identify the cultural structure of a society, or perhaps to use Kaplan's term, a civilization, though I'll also mention that I remember Gilman and I discussing the work of Clifford Geertz, Religion as a Cultural System, which I think later, at some later point, helped shape the way Gilman thought about myth as well. Gilman continues, and that's in that same part of the quotation, religious myths do all this for a religious community. They also convey the community's distinctive answers to ultimate human questions. Why am I here? What is the meaning or purpose of my existence? And there are Gilman lists other questions in that passage as well. I didn't include the full list of them. Thinking of religious myth as the broader set of religious commitments of a particular human society is a helpful update to Buber's approach and shares Buber's desire to retain the revelatory nature of Jewish religious language, even if we are not certain about the historicity of the events recounted. For Gilman, revelation as a theological category points to the way a society becomes bound to its own particular way of addressing questions of ultimate meaning, a term he draws from theologian Paul Tillich, who heavily influenced his use of myth. Gilman's use of the term myth thus avoids the burden of having to affirm that particular historical events actually happened, a burden I'm not sure most Jews today could endure, and Gilman was very aware of this. But once this move has been made, from Buber's historical realism to Gilman's sociological realism, my question is, what do we need to use the terminology of myth? Or sorry, let me rephrase that. Why do we need to use the terminology of myth in what Gilman calls religious epistemology? If this is a move to a kind of metaphysical realism, what sort of commitment does it entail? Gilman's answer comes from a passage from the essay, Knowing God, that I cited above, and this is the last quotation. What are these God patterns? They constitute what I call the core of the classic metaphorical system for God in Judaism. A sense of the integrity of all things, God is Echad, one. A sense of a transcendent reality that governs all of history and nature. A sense that this reality is personal, that is, relates in a personal way with all reality. And finally, what Heschel in his book, The Prophets, called the divine pathos, a sense that this transcendent reality cares about creation and about me. Now, I find that this is a very compelling articulation of what it means for us to believe in God without a commitment to supernaturalism. But I'm still left wondering what kind of commitment I am indeed making here. Moreover, the promise of Gilman's project of religious epistemology is to show how knowledge of God is akin to knowledge of quarks, egos, and the New York Knicks passing game. But what strikes me about this passage is how much it serves to highlight the stark differences between these forms of knowledge. And so I ask, what has Gilman accomplished here for us? Let me turn again to Buber. In drawing his well-known distinction between I-it and I-thou relations, Buber clearly places religious life and experience in the I-thou realm of spiritual and ethical responsiveness. And the forms of knowledge generated by the natural sciences are clearly in the realm of I-it. I-it relations of utility have their place in life, but Buber warns that the pervasiveness of I-it forms of life, particularly in modern life, has a spiritually and ethically corrosive effect on the human soul. To my mind, this is why he is content not to have a religious epistemology. For Buber, when we say that we know God or know another person, we are not really using knowledge in the same way as when we say that we know that there are quarks. Thus, Buber might seem to endorse a dual epistemology that Gilman rejects, but I think it is better to say that Buber is completely eschewing the project of religious epistemology. He doesn't think we need any philosophical account of how we justify the words we use for God. Buber never says what he thinks about the project of epistemology as a branch of philosophy, but I think it's fair to say that he would think that such a project might have its place in relationship to scientific endeavors in the realm of I-it, and that like anything else of the I-it realm, it is completely unsuited to understanding the phenomena of religious life. Moreover, Buber might say that the attempt to have a religious epistemology fails to do justice to the spiritual power of theological language by granting authority to social practices that objectify and utilize rather than practices of relating to, affirming, and caring for others. In other words, for Buber, searching for a religious epistemology in Gilman's sense might actually undermine the power of theological language rather than giving us confidence in their meaning. That said, I have much sympathy for Gilman's underlying concern that we be able to explain our language about God to be about something real. And this is, I think, what he wanted to teach his students. Indeed, on this point, our own Art Green has noted that Buber is usually too vague about what he means when he says he believes in God. However, I would also note that Buber's writings point in the direction of the centrality of oneness very much as Gilman articulates it. And I would say here also Heschel speaks about oneness in a very powerful way. There's a passage in God in Search of Man that's titled "Oneness is the Standard," and I think that one can see that passage as a source for the passage of Gilman's that I cited above. And that returns me to the question that I wish to leave us with: what kind of substantive claim is it to have a sense of the integrity of all things, that there is a transcendent reality that loves me and needs me? Gilman insists that it is not merely a poetic claim, but could it be merely an ethical one? And if we say that, do we risk a reductionism of religion to ethics that has been present as an option in Jewish thought for about 200 years? How would we get out of that dilemma? And I just want to add, I think, as I sort of anticipated but wasn't sure, Art Green's paper does represent a very powerful example of explicating what does it mean to think of God as having a sense of oneness in the world, or connecting to a sense of oneness in the world, though obviously very different than the direction of Buber, Heschel, and Neil Gilman. I don't have time here to go further with how we might address these questions, but I want to conclude with a reflection of what Buber and Gilman's work suggests to me about the project of religious naturalism. In a sense, I want to take a little something from each thinker. From Buber, I wish to draw on his wariness of allowing the authoritative standing of scientific knowledge from forcing us to make demythologizing reductions of theological language. I worry that when Gilman compares knowledge of God to knowledge of quarks, it actually serves to demythologize and naturalize knowledge of God despite his intentions. At the same time, I endorse Gilman's insistence that we must be prepared to explain what it is we mean by our use of theological language. We should be able to say what it's about. What I question is whether we need to make the natural sciences a point of reference, or more so a point of authority or source of authority in explaining these theological claims. What I'm suggesting, I think, is that when it comes to epistemology and philosophy of language in the field of theology, what we need may not be naturalism, but rather just pragmatism. One brief way to define pragmatism is as the insistence that truth claims are always justified in a particular sociolinguistic context, in a particular society, culture, or language game, or again, as Mordecai Kaplan put it, in a particular civilization. In the end, what I find most compelling about both Gilman's work and Kaplan's work is not so much their naturalism, but their pragmatism. In Gilman, this is best exemplified with the more sociolinguistic definition of myth in Sacred Fragments. In Kaplan's work, this is best exemplified by his suggestion that Jews could live in two civilizations, American and Jewish. As a public philosophy of democratic life, pragmatism exudes the hope that we might be able to engage in different forms of conversation in different forms of community. Kaplan was interested in broader sociocultural structures that he called civilizations, but we could also apply this pragmatist sensibility to areas of knowledge and practice, what Wittgenstein called language games, that we call science, scholarship, religion, or ethics, just to name a few. We engage in these areas of discussion with some sense of what they are about, but in moments of crisis, we might need to give our topics some clarity by changing what we say or by giving a more foundational account of our subject. And sometimes that's what people call metaphysics. Whether that's the right name for it or not, I'm not quite sure. In the West, religion in general, and Judaism in particular, has been dealing with such a crisis for about 250 years. The crux of the crisis is probably this. How can religious claims be taken seriously if they are not comprehensible in terms of the dominant knowledge structures of the culture? One compelling response is to acknowledge that no one will appreciate the power of Judaism unless they are exposed to Judaism that is free to be itself on its own terms, without needing to justify its values in terms of a different language game. What Neil Gilman succeeded most of all in doing, as Buber and Rosenzweig and Heschel did before him, was bringing his students into contact with the distinctive language game of the tradition, revealing its spiritual power to them, as Buber said, to their inner life, to their sense of duty, and then inviting them to clarify their theological commitments, to be able to speak them with confidence in their truth. So, Yehi Zichrono Baruch, may this, and for his many kindnesses, may Neil Gilman's memory be truly blessed. Thank you.
Amen. So first question for Nadav from Dr. Sandy Goldberg, who will be speaking tomorrow morning. Sandy asks, you mentioned Spinoza's unpalatable views on foreigners as evidence of the slippery slope of rationalism, but why blame these views on rationalism rather than on Spinoza's employment of rationalism on this occasion? And how can rationalism itself be a slippery slope? I'm not sure I understand this claim in the first place.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not a specialist of Spinoza, but beneath the overall rationalism of Spinoza, there lies some again shaky concepts as a conatus or striving, which is ultimately very egoistic power, and could be seen as a proto-Darwinist in this regard. And Spinoza is equating the value of existence, of the conatus, with the very existence. So it comes out that there are some tensions between the basic idea of what is integrity and prudence and so on, and what the actual approach. And again, Melamed is remarking that there is a tension between the title, ethics, of this book, and some of its underlying arguments.
Thank you. Let me point out there's a good deal of interesting material in the public chat, the chat to everyone. So again, I encourage people to look at it. I'm doing my best to save those for distribution later too. Sydney Nestel asks Emily Filler to comment on Kaplan's view of democracy and multiculturalism as opposed to, quote, national, close quotes, democracy.
I think this is a really important and complicated question. If we were only talking about the United States, I think I would say instinctively and emphatically that Kaplan understands multiculturalism of a kind to be necessary, if only because Jews are a minority. So there's a kind of practical sense in which multiculturalism is important. And of course, this is like what Jews do in the United States. What complicates my ability to answer the question kind of more clearly is that it's less clear to me what that means to him in the Israeli context. In the Israeli context is where I think he is uncharacteristically optimistic and naive about how it is that states may develop. It's really less clear to me what he imagines, how constitutively he imagines multiculturalism to be functioning in the Israeli context. I think he does think that a good Israeli polity is multicultural, at least to some degree. But it's not clear to me that he has a kind of clear sense of how that works. Whereas in the United States, I think he has a very clear idea of how that functions, or like what the mechanism is of multiculturalism.
Great. Carol Kastner asks a beautiful question. I don't know if anybody wants to answer it though, but she asks whether the musical direction, and that is the direction of musical scores, and pardon me for butchering the German, but Sehnsucht, is this an expression of the search for the supernatural? So Sehnsucht is a German, I think, for a yearning, wistful longing. It's a musical direction as I understand it. Is that an expression of the search for the supernatural? It's a very poetic question. Anyway, I wanted to get it out there. Mel, turning back to you. Mel, you're still with us? Mel? Oh, no. Emily, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this will be for anybody. Putting together some of the interesting conversation prompted by Rabbi Tucker's question about the relative role of diaries and published works, I think in any case, looking across that spectrum of works, private, if you will, and published, well, if I ask the question, I don't mean to comment. Is it fair to say that it's difficult to talk about Kaplan's theology because there are so many of them? That yes, he is transnatural in one place, or likes transnatural. He likes there are clearly places where he speaks of himself as a naturalist, and others where he's using supernaturalist, as Mel taught us. It's interesting. It's inspiring, I think, in a way, to see a thinker like Kaplan, who's more than a thinker because he's engaging so much with the real world of the Jewish community, if you will, exploring almost till the time of his death at the ripe old age of 102, lots of different concepts or formulations of the God concept, as he might have said. So, any thoughts on the multiplicity of theologies that one encounters in Kaplan?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say just briefly that I think that it strikes me, and I haven't delved into the diaries as much as, certainly not as much as Mel, but maybe as much as others have. But it strikes me that he's Kaplan is struggling with the terminology he wishes to use to identify the position that he has, and that while he may think about that position in different ways, there are certain parameters that he sets up. And I think Emily's paper really draws attention to a very key set of parameters around the significance of democracy for his project. So I think I would just add to that like I think in Judaism as Civilization, he makes it clear that like something like what we mean by multicultural democracy is very crucial to him in his understanding of what he means by democracy, and that sort of chauvinistic democracy or chauvinistic nationalism is supposed to be outside the boundaries of what he's talking about. But I think, I do think that, in struggling over his own sort of terminology, Kaplan is very clear about some of these parameters. And I think that's helpful in kind of understanding what is it that he's doing when he's struggling with that terminology. And also to say that it's a little bit different than what someone like Neil Gaiman is talking about in other parts of his work that I didn't really get to, but is connected to what I was speaking about, which is when Jews sort of think about the metaphors from the classical tradition, right? Where we struggle over, for example, an important example for Gilman was, the passage in Hosea that people recite when putting on tefillin, that I betroth you to me, and all the very problematic, abusive imagery around that. And so when are there images of God that we wish to dispense with or retire within the tradition? I don't think that, I mean, there may be points in which Kaplan's struggling with that also. But I gather that when we talk about like supernaturalism and transnaturalism and all these kinds of things, that's a very different kind of struggle for Kaplan than the one that Gilman is talking about when we have these powerful personalistic metaphors and we're trying to figure out which are the ones that really speak to us theologically. So,
great. Another question for you, Bill. What does this is from Stuart Rose? What does Gilman mean in that God patterns passage by God having a personal dimension relating personally to creation, or what do you suppose he means?
Who did the question come from? Just
Stuart Rose.
Eric Rose. Okay, thank you. I think that's a great question, right? In other words, I think that's where the question, that's the crux of the question is that, and I think what I want to push at is to say, in this kind of Buberian vein, is to say that I think where Gilman stands is to say that we can't really appreciate the spiritual power of belief in God without simply just using these personalistic images, and that they can't be sort of cashed out into something else, which is, I think, what Kaplan is often doing, right? Whether it's process theology or predicate theology. And I think what it means then is to simply speak of being loved or being or experiencing a dialogical relationship with something beyond us, with the kind of unity in existence that's not reducible to some other kind of thing. And I think that may be challenging to understand, or perhaps challenging to articulate, as I'm doing right here. But I think that's really the crux of the challenge. I think more work can be done, but that's really the crux of it. Yeah.
Great. So we have, again, a plea from several people to all of our wonderful panelists this afternoon. Anything you're willing to share after the fact in terms of written materials will be appreciated, which is, of course, a nice compliment to all of you. We'll close with this question for Nadav. Nadav, you're still here? Oop, unmute. Nadav?
Yes.
How do you suppose a Gnostic would respond to Kaplan's conception of law as Emily Filler presented it?
Yes, that's a good question. I guess Gnostic would would disagree. I mean, Kaplan's approach, obviously, I mean, it seems obvious that he is aware of the problem of antinomianism. So I would think that Kaplan perhaps would endorse my argument. I just wanted to add something, Bill, about what you said, because maybe a way to challenge Kaplan on this naturalism theme is to challenge his somehow old-fashioned concept of the distinction between the natural sciences and the humanities and religion in this regard. And maybe Mel can illuminate me on that, but I don't know actually if Kaplan was aware of this important paper by Quine, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, which catches really an important point that Pierce, James, Dewey, they made, but it became famous by Quine and by others. And it really undermines the idea that in secular studies, we have like a bedrock, it's all certain, whereas in religious, it is all subjective. But actually, I think I saw Professor Bob Pollack around, the biologist. I'm not sure if it's, maybe Mel can again verify that or not, but he's talking about the biology of faith and the faith of biology, and he's a serious biologist, I'm not. And so I think one of the challenges is really to question this really old-fashioned idea that in the exact sciences, it is just clear-cut questions and simplistic answers. And I think part of the beauty of political theology of this discipline is in challenging this separation between the secular and the sacred. And I hope that Kaplan would agree or not.
Great. So this actually leads right into the conversation tomorrow morning. So we will adjourn for the day. Let me thank again all 7 of our wonderful speakers. I hope you found the day as stimulating as I did. I will get a recording out to the whole group if I can tonight. And I hope many of you will join us tomorrow for, although again, it will be recorded. So have a good rest of your afternoon or evening as the case may be.
Thank you.